If I said the word pirate to you, what would be the first thing that popped into your head? Probably geezers sailing the high seas, stealing booty, raping, pillaging, plundering, all of that stuff. People like Captain Blackbeard, or, you know, fictional people like Captain Jack Sparrow or Captain Hook. Maybe that one uncle that you have that you only see at Christmas time who's pure knockoff Nigel and gets all of the latest movies off of torrent sites and stuff. You don't really ever associate piracy with women, though, do you? But what if I told you that one of the most badass pirates in the history of piracy was in fact a woman? Today we're inducting into the Carnage Collective the Pirate Queen, Ching Shih. Ching Shih was born in 1785 in Guangdong province in China. And not a lot's known about her upbringing or her childhood or anything, but the two things that we do know for certain are that her birth name was Shi Zhanggu, and she spent a huge amount of her teenage years as a prostitute and later on as a madam in the city of Canton. She spent her teenage years working on a flower boat. Not as a florist, though. Essentially, a flower boat was a floating pleasure palace that would sail up and down the coast, allowing girls who were riding aboard it and working there to peddle their flowers to sailors and villagers, fishermen, that sort of thing. Imagine a Jabba the Hutt style palace type thing, just on a boat instead of in the desert. In 1801, when Ching Shih was just 16 years old, the flower boat was visited by a notorious pirate lord named Zheng Yi. Now, Zheng had just turned up to purchase some flowers, you know, casually as you... and he met Ching Shih, and apparently fell madly in love with her. I don't know if this was just over the one visit, or if he visited multiple times, but the story goes that he became infatuated with her, and shortly after, asked her to marry him. There's a couple of variations on how this story goes. I'm choosing to believe the more romantic of the two, in which he met her, fell wildly in love, and the two became inseparable. There are arguments to be had that Yi decided that it was a good idea to just raid this thing for some sex slaves, but it's less romantic, and I don't like that one. So we're going with the fact that they fell in love naturally. Just go with me here. She was well known as being quite a shrewd businesswoman. She was a madam on the flower boat at this point in time, and so business had kind of become second nature to her, and she was real good at it. So she wasn't just going to agree to this marriage without first covering her ass. She is said to have lent her powers of intrigue, as it were, to her husband's endeavours by way of a formal contract. She agreed to his proposal of marriage, but only after he agreed to give her a seat of power within his organisation, and with that power, an equal share of whatever plunder was taken. And Zheng Yi agreed to these terms, and so Ching Shih and Zheng Yi in 1801 were married, and together they formed the Red Flag Fleet. The pair formed the Cantonese Pirate Coalition, which brought together a large number of really powerful pirate lords in the region into their fleet. So they basically had formed a navy of pirates. Now, in a very 1800s Power Rangers type move, I think, the fleets were colour-coded. So the primary fleet was the Red Fleet, and fleets underneath were white, black, blue, yellow, and green. And so the pair were doing really well for themselves. The marriage had worked out quite well, in that Zheng Yi had got far more than he bargained for when he went aboard the flower boat for a little puss-puss, and Ching Shih had got a massive position of power. The Red Flag Fleet at this time had roughly 70,000 pirates under its command, so it was a huge organisation. And as you can imagine, they were making money. Hella booty. But the thing is, on the 16th of November 1807, Zheng Yi died in Vietnam at the age of 39. This was just 6 years after the pair were married. So he left a bit of a vacuum in his wake, because as you can imagine, 70,000 pirates need a strong leader. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Ching Shih was a real smart cookie, and that was part of the reason that Zheng Yi was so attracted to her in the first place. She'd spent the last 6 years at the high table. She'd not really wanted for anything. She'd worked hard, sure, but she'd not really wanted for anything like she had previously. And she knew that there were two things that were going to happen here. She was either going to fall back into a life of prostitution, which she did not want, or she was going to rise to become a powerful pirate lord. And that's what she decided to do. She started immediately maneuvering herself into her former husband's leadership position. Now, when the pair were married, Zheng Yi and Ching Shih adopted a son, Chang Pao, who was Zheng Yi's second in command in the organization. Now, Ching Shih could have just stepped down, taken a bit of a backseat role instead of having any kind of power, and allowed Zheng Yi's power to just trickle down to Chang Pao. But she didn't want that. She didn't want an easy life. She wanted to continue being a powerful pirate lord. So instead, she garnered the support of Chang Pao. With Chang Pao's support, and now her second in command, Ching Shih took charge. She commanded roughly 70,000 men and women in her pirate crew, and with the Red Flag Fleet, she controlled South China Seas for years to come. It didn't take very long at all for the Chinese government to realise what a threat Ching Shih and her Red Flag Fleet was in the South China Sea. In January 1808, they formed their navy to go and do battle with the Red Flag Fleet to try and stop her. It didn't go well for them, though, because Ching Shih and her Red Flag bad boys beat the ever-loving shit out of the Chinese Navy, murked off the crew of any of the ships that weren't sunk, and just stole their ships to add to her ever-growing fleet. Now, I'm really not over-exaggerating the beating that the Navy took at the hands of Ching Shih and the Red Flag Fleet. It was so bad that they had to resort to using fishing vessels instead of naval ships while they rebuilt their navy. It was bad. Ching Shih had proved to all of her crew without a shadow of a doubt that she was a master tactician with her dominance of the Chinese Navy at this point in time. What she did after that, though, was prove that she was a woman to be respected and trusted. She earned the trust of her top lieutenants by allowing the upper echelon of her crew to captain some of these newly captured Chinese naval vessels. But now what she'd done is she'd created a bit of a thirst for recognition among all of these new captains. They all wanted to be recognized by Ching Shih, and so they ran roughshod over the South China Sea. They would raid ships, they would go to coastal villages, river towns, anywhere they could find any kind of civilization. These guys would be there raiding and demanding a contribution to the organization, all so that they could please Ching Shih. Before Ching Shih was ever a pirate, she was a businesswoman, and she maintained her businesswoman mindset throughout the entirety of her career as a pirate, and it might be one of the reasons that she was so successful. She was feared and respected among her peers as one of the most strict and regimented pirate lords that they'd ever known. She valued business acumen and military strategy more than anything else amongst her crew, and one of the things that she fought to do whilst she was leading the Red Flag Fleet was to form a kind of pirate government, under which all of the pirates under her command would be bound to and protected by a set of laws and taxes. These laws and taxes were heavily enforced and everybody adhered to them. The Red Flag Fleet was not a small group of Roman vagabonds, right? It was roughly 70,000 people that Ching Shih commanded. Now, she unified all 70,000 of these people under her new government by enforcing a strict code of laws. This code was followed by everybody to the letter, because if anybody broke any of these laws, the punishments were quickly enforced. These punishments started out at a very base level of any pirate that was giving his own orders or refused to follow the orders of a superior was beheaded on the spot. One of the rules that Ching Shih's government brought into effect that I actually have a lot of time for, considering it's a rule that came up from a pirate lord, is that basically there were a lot of people within the South China Sea, the public, who recognized Ching Shih's power and recognized that the Red Flag Fleet were kind of a force within the South China Seas. And so a lot of townsfolk, a lot of villages offered up tribute to the Red Flag Fleet by forms of money or whatever they had to give to these people. One of the laws that Ching Shih brought into effect offered these people protection, because it said that if anybody was to steal from a village or a town or anything who had already offered up tribute to the Red Flag Fleet, the pirate that did so would be beheaded. Other laws that were put in place dictated what happened with all of the booty that the Red Flag Fleet was bringing in. Everything would be brought in for group inspection and then would be divvied up under a set of guidelines that were already predetermined. So 20% of the value of any goods that were brought in would be returned to the ship that brought them in. The other 80% would be divvied up into a sort of public fund. Any actual money that was brought in, though, was kind of a different matter. You'd only receive a small portion of the money that your ship brought in. The rest of it would go to buying goods for unsuccessful ships, like better cannons, ammunition, more people, things like that. After hearing this, you might be thinking to yourself, well, gee, you big ginger nerd, why the hell would these alleged pirates not just take all of this booty for themselves? This all sounds a bit communistic, doesn't it? Kind of, yeah, I guess. But like I said earlier, all of these rules had punishments that went with them should they be broken. Punishment for breaking any of these rules, as in turning over any goods, the first time was a severe flogging by a bunch of people. The second time, though, was death. So your choices were turn over your goods for inspection and divvying up, or get a fucking beating, or be killed. I don't know about you, but I'd take the 20% and I'd be fucking happy about it. Also, another thing you got to really think about with that is it wasn't just the 20% that you'd be getting. There was a communal fund that you could take stuff out of. So if you needed anything for your ship, you were totally able to take it from the public fund. Also, if you were unsuccessful, you'd get a bunch of money from other successful pirates. So it kind of did work. Sometimes you would give more than you'd get, but other times you'd give fuck all and you'd get some stuff. So, I mean, now Ching Shih, having worked at a brothel before all of this piracy stuff, knew that it kind of sucked to be a woman in some cases at this point in time, and she also knew that men kind of sucked too. So she had special rules when it came to female captives. Generally speaking, there weren't any female captives usually. What would happen is, if a female happened to be on board a ship that was taken captive by the Red Flag Fleet, she would be let go the very first time they made port. I say generally because there were some exceptions to this. If the woman was from a wealthy family or looked like she might fetch a handsome ransom, that rhymes, she would be ransomed. Sometimes also the pirates would take wives or concubines or whatever. However, these rules that Ching Shih had about women prisoners extended to these wives. They basically said if a pirate took one of these captives as a wife, he had to be faithful to her. If he wasn't faithful to her, he would have cannonballs strapped to his feet and be chucked overboard. Now, pirates are generally well known for raping, pillaging, plundering, right? Well, not Ching Shih. She had absolutely zero time for rapists. If any of her pirates were found to have raped a female captive, or in fact anyone, they would be put to death immediately. Obviously, it had to be proved that something happened, so usually the only rapists that were put to death were the ones who didn't immediately kill the people that they raped. But regardless, Ching Shih had no time for it and would immediately kill anyone who was found guilty of this crime. One of the weird things that she had, though, was I feel like she had a bit of a hard-on for marriage, because if a pirate was found to have consensual sex with any female captive and they weren't married after the fact, she would behead the pirate, but then strap cannonballs to the legs of the female captive and throw her overboard, which, in my opinion, kind of overkill and also not cool. The list of laws that Ching Shih's government brought into effect is kind of a long one, so I'm not going to go through all of them. Suffice it to say, though, violators of a lot of the other parts of her code faced flogging, being beaten to death, being clapped in irons, being quartered, being bled out, which is kind of an interesting one, being hung. A lot of the rules had people being thrown overboard with cannonballs tied to their feet. Yeah, she was pretty brutal, man. Loyalty and honesty were greatly appreciated amongst Ching Shih's organisation. And I previously mentioned that she rewarded her lieutenants quite generously with those naval ships, right? So people who did prove themselves worthy were generously rewarded. That set an example for all of the other pirates to do the same thing, because they obviously wanted some super cool ships and they wanted all of the stuff that Ching Shih was giving away. However, on the flip side of this, people who deserted or people who left the organization without first seeking permission from somebody above them were made deserters, and people who left the organization without first seeking permission to do so were hunted down, brought back to the fleet, had their ears chopped off, and were paraded around to make an example of. This punishment in particular made a lot of the pirates under Ching Shih's command shit scared of her, because no one wants to get their ears lopped off, let's be honest. What are you without ears? You're a fucking potato head. No one cares for that. It forced them to be calculated when they were attacking. It forced them to be desperate when they were defending. It forced them to never give up, even when they were outnumbered. They would rather die than go back and face Ching Shih's wrath. By 1809, Ching Shih had become known as the Terror of the South China Sea. Everybody in the region knew who she was, everybody in the region knew what her fleet was capable of, and nobody dared question her authority. Any that did resist her, however, were brought on board her ship, would have their feet nailed to the floor by Ching Shih, and she would personally beat them to death to set an example to others who might think of doing the same. In September and November of 1809, Ching Shih and the Red Flag Fleet suffered numerous defeats at the hands of the Portuguese Navy, who, unfortunately, she'd gotten on the wrong side of. These skirmishes were known as the Battle of Tiger's Mouth, and in 1810, in January, Ching Shih would surrender to the Portuguese Navy. Now, elsewhere in China, the emperor was pretty pissed off that a woman was so dominating the South China Sea, and in particular, his navy. So he formed a plan to try and get rid of Ching Shih and her Red Flag Fleet by offering amnesty to anybody who was found guilty of piracy. All they had to do was turn themselves in, and they would be granted immunity from prosecution. They'd be able to keep any plunder that they had gathered over the years, and they'd be able to just retire and go and do whatever they wanted, free of any criminal charges. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Above all else, Ching Shih was a shrewd businesswoman. She realised at this point in time that there was no point in persisting, and there was no point whatsoever in turning down the Emperor's offer. Her fleet had been decimated by the Portuguese Navy, so she readily accepted the Emperor's offer. All that they needed to do was surrender, so that's what they did. The Red Flag Fleet surrendered unconditionally to the Emperor's will. The Emperor allowed, in return, all pirates to face no charges whatsoever, no repercussions for any of the crimes that they'd done whilst under the flag of the Red Flag Fleet. And moreover, they were able to keep all of the loot, all of the wealth that they had obtained over their years of piracy. What's more, a lot of Ching Shih's crew after the fact were given jobs within Chinese bureaucracy. They were actually sitting pretty. When you consider how most pirates end their careers, usually is at the bottom of the sea with their ships, these guys had done pretty well for themselves. At some point over the course of their years together at the helm of the Red Flag Fleet, Ching Shih and Chang Pao were married. And whilst Ching Shih was done with a life of piracy and wanted to leave the ocean behind in favour of a more peaceful life on land, Chang Pao certainly was not done with it. So it's lucky then that when I mentioned earlier that the Emperor gave positions in the Chinese bureaucracy to some of her lieutenants, he offered Chang Pao the position of the head of the Guangdong Navy, which he gladly accepted. He lived the rest of his life out at sea until his death in 1822. In 1813, Ching Shih had her first son, Chang Yulin, and also a daughter. However, we don't know the daughter's name, and in fact, her name and everything about her has been lost to history. So somewhere out there, Ching Shih has descendants. In 1822, after the death of Chang Pao, Ching Shih and her two children moved to Macau, where they opened a gambling house using the wealth that she'd amassed during her time at sea. In 1844, she died peacefully in her sleep, in her bed, surrounded by her children and grandkids. Now, I think that's just a really cool ending to a really cool life. She had done everything that a pirate did, really. She had looted, she had pillaged, she formed a government, she made her own rules, and she lived life her own way, and I think that's fucking dope. She died at the age of 69, though, which in my head I'm like, oh, come on, man. There's a joke there somewhere about you were a prostitute and you died at the age of 69, but I'm not gonna go there.